Before we get to today's episode, I want to thank you for listening to Bible Threads and remind you that Time of Grace Ministry has many other resources to strengthen your walk with Jesus. Videos, books, Bible studies, devotions, podcasts, and blogs. You can find them all on our website at timeofgrace.org. I also want to thank you for telling your friends and relatives about Time of Grace and for supporting us so that we can point more people to what matters most, Jesus. The Bible is incredibly interconnected with threads that run through it from beginning to end. In this podcast, I will uncover these threads, help you dig deeper into God's truth, and inspire you to live your life with greater confidence and joy. Welcome to Bible Threads with me, Dr. Bruce Becker. When I initially planned this series, this episode was going to focus on the stone altars mentioned in the Bible. But as I began to prepare for this episode, a couple of verses in the book of Exodus revealed that I needed to think more broadly than just stone altars. I needed to include earthen altars. So that's why I changed the title of this episode from the original stone altars to natural altars. The verses that expanded my thinking are from Exodus chapter 20. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this. You have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Whatever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed." Okay, there's a lot to unpack in these 5 verses. First, the Lord God told Moses to tell the Israelites, no idols. No man-made idols of silver or gold or any other material. Second, the Lord God described how he wanted to be worshipped, with animal sacrifices on an altar. The sacrifices would be either a burnt offering, in which the entire animal, typically without the hide, was burned on the altar, or a fellowship offering, also known as a peace offering, in which a portion of the animal was burned on the altar, and the remaining portion was shared as food by the priests doing the sacrifices. From the book of Leviticus, we learn that the burnt offering was a voluntary offering with the purpose of acknowledging the sin of the worshiper and an expression of devotion to the Lord God. We also learn from the book of Leviticus that a fellowship or peace offering was a voluntary offering made for one of 3 reasons. It could be made as a free will offering, meaning that the worshiper was making the sacrifice as a way to express thanksgiving for God's grace and blessing. Or it could be made in connection with the fulfillment of a vow. An example of this is when Hannah fulfilled her vow by bringing her son Samuel to the temple, whom she dedicated for a lifetime of service. On that day, Hannah also brought a fellowship offering with her. The third purpose of a fellowship offering was to give thanks for the Lord God's deliverance at a time of difficult struggle. The final directive that the Lord God specified to Moses was the kind of altars on which these sacrifices were to be made, either an earthen altar or one of natural uncut stone. And the altar was to be at ground level. There were to be no steps up to the altar. The altars were to be simple and made out of natural material that God himself had made at creation, not something man-made. With these directives to Moses, the Lord God was establishing a sharp contrast between how he wanted to be worshipped and how the people, who lived all around the Israelites, worshipped their pagan idols. The altars to the pagan idols were man-made, handcrafted, often designed and built as elaborate structures. They reflected human achievement and artistry. They were often built on the top of hills or mountains for everyone to see. That's why these pagan worship sites are referred to in the Bible as high places. These pagan sites often had steps to climb to get to the actual altar. Now, if you need an idea of what they may have looked like, think of the Mayan or Aztec temples in Mexico. Pyramid-like structures with steps that lead to the top. Pagan altars and temples were always focused on what a human being accomplished, a striking contrast to how the Lord God wanted to be worshipped. So let's travel through the Bible and scope out the altars built for the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, that would have either been earthen altars or made of uncut stone. Our first stop is during the time of Noah. Because of the evil in the world, the Lord God told Noah that he was going to destroy the world through a worldwide flood, and he directed Noah to build an ark. The ark would be a floating zoo to preserve animal life along with Noah and his family. By the way, have you ever been to the Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky? Our family visited it for the first time this past summer. What struck me the most was the amount of space within the ark. There was so much space devoted to walkways in the Kentucky replica that would have been available to Noah to house animals and their food and water. The ark was immense. And if you haven't visited the Ark Encounter and you have the opportunity, I'd recommend it. Well, the flood came. From the time the flood began to the time that the ground was once again dry was just over a year. When the ground was dry enough, Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on land came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." Now, we don't know if the altar that Noah built was an earthen one or a stone one, only that he built an altar. We also need to keep in mind that the Lord God hadn't specified the type of altar to be used until Moses' day, centuries later. Anyway, on the altar he built, Noah sacrificed burnt offerings. Now, before the floodwaters came, the Lord God had directed Noah to take additional clean animals and birds into the ark that could be used as sacrifices. The Bible's account of these additional clean animals isn't really crystal clear. The Hebrew text uses the number 7. But Bible scholars are split on whether the 7 refers to individual animals and birds or 7 pairs of each. I lean toward the 7 pairs because that is how the unclean animals are described, as a pair, one male and one female. But we don't know that for sure. We also don't know from the book of Genesis what animals were clean and which ones were unclean. That again would be detailed to Moses on Mount Sinai. But obviously the Lord God had revealed it to Noah, because he knew. The next altars built to the Lord God, to Yahweh Elohim, were the 3 altars built by Abraham. When Abraham was 75 years old, he lived in Haran, the home of his father Terah's clan. Haran was located in the southeastern part of modern-day Turkey near the Syrian border. It was in Haran that the Lord God called Abraham to go and live in the land of Canaan, the land that the Lord would promise to Abraham and his descendants. And so we're told, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. Shechem was an important town in the Old Testament. In fact, it's mentioned by name 54 times by my count. It was located near the twin mountains of Ebal and Gerizim, in the central part of the land of Canaan. From there, he, Abraham, went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Bethel was located about 15 miles straight south of Shechem, and the route that Abraham would have taken would later be known as the High Road through the hill country of Ephraim. The third altar that Abraham built was the altar on Mount Moriah, on which the Lord God had told Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son Isaac. If you know the story, just as Abraham was about to plunge a knife into Isaac, the Lord God intervened and stopped Abraham. The Lord then provided a substitute sacrifice, a ram caught in a thicket, to be offered on that altar. Now, 1,000 years later, King David would purchase a threshing floor that existed on Mount Moriah. He would build an altar there, anticipating the day when the first temple, Solomon's temple, would be built on that location in Jerusalem. At that temple, sacrifices would be made daily. And 1,000 years after King David lived, in the near vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem, another substitutionary sacrifice would be made, the one at Mount Calvary, by Jesus for us. Abraham's son Isaac built one altar during his lifetime that we know about. In Genesis chapter 26, we learn about a severe famine that hit the land of Canaan. It forced Isaac and his family to move temporarily to Gerar, a Philistine town ruled by King Abimelech. While in Gerar, the Lord God blessed Isaac immensely. Isaac had so many flocks and herds and servants that Abimelech asked him to leave. So from the town of Gerar, Isaac settled in the valley of Gerar to the southeast. But after a quarrel with the locals over water rights, Isaac moved his clan to Beersheba, located further southeast in the southern third of the land of Canaan. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you, and you will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. Did you notice that both Abraham and Isaac built an altar following the Lord God's promise that their descendants would greatly increase in number? It was a way to acknowledge the Lord's promises. Do you recall in the third episode of this series where we examined commemorative stones in the Bible? The first one that we considered was the stone that first served as Jacob's pillow after he fled home because he had stolen his brother Esau's blessing. Jacob then set that stone up as a memorial the next day after experiencing during the night the vision of the stairway to heaven. The name of that place was Bethel. Now, fast forward 20 years. Jacob returned from Haran, where he had been working for his uncle Laban, and was eventually reunited with his brother Esau. After that reunion, Jacob went to Shechem, where he bought a piece of land and built an altar. After a sad and sordid incident involving Jacob's daughter Dinah and two of his sons, Simeon and Levi, the Lord God told Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. It was also there at Bethel that the Lord God changed Jacob's name to Israel, which means he struggles with God. The next stop on our altar tour is during the life of Moses. After the exodus out of Egypt, and before the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, they were attacked by the Amalekites at Rephidim. Following the Israelite victory, Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord. Moses also built an altar at the foot of Mount Sinai. In the days and weeks when the Lord God was transmitting his covenant law to Moses, Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws. They responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Sadly, they didn't. Within weeks, they would be worshiping a golden calf. Now fast forward 40 years. After the death of Moses, Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After defeating the cities of Jericho and Ai, the Israelites traveled to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Nearby would have been the city of, you've got it, Shechem. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what was written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones, on which no tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. There in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. Then when we get to the period of the judges, we only find one judge who built an altar to the Lord God. It was Gideon. One day the angel of the Lord God himself, came to visit Gideon and commissioned him to lead the Israelites against the people of Midian. The Midianites, among others, were ruining the Israelites' crops and killing their animals, and this had been going on for 7 years. But Gideon didn't think he was the man for the job, so the Lord had to convince him with a miracle. The result of this miraculous event was that Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. That same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering." The Hebrew phrase translated as "a proper kind of altar" can also be translated as "with layers of stone," indicating the kind of altar that it was. Gideon did what the Lord God had told him. Not surprisingly, the people of the town the next morning were not happy with what Gideon did. In fact, they wanted to kill him. At the end of the period of the judges is when the judge and prophet Samuel lived. As judge over Israel, he would travel the circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel. And he built an altar there to the Lord. When the nation of Israel asked for a king, it was the prophet Samuel who anointed their first king, Saul. After Saul was anointed, Samuel instructed Saul, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." During that week, the Philistines gathered their army near the town of Michmash, a town in the hill country. As Saul impatiently waited for Samuel to arrive, many of his soldiers deserted the army, leaving him only 600 soldiers. Saul panicked, and without waiting for Samuel, he decided to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings himself. And as soon as he had made the sacrifices, Samuel arrived. Samuel rebuked Saul for his disobedience, an action that would cost him and his descendants the throne in Israel. Despite his disobedience, the Lord God gave Saul victory over the Philistines at Michmash. Following that victory, Saul built an altar to the Lord, his first and only one. The last altar that we want to consider was actually a rebuild of an altar on Mount Carmel by the prophet Elijah. Elijah had challenged the prophets of Baal to a sacrifice contest to determine who should be the God of Israel. The prophets of Baal called upon their idol to burn up the sacrifice on their altar. When Baal didn't show up, it was Elijah's turn. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. If you know the rest of the story, the Lord God showed up and sent fire from the heavens to consume Elijah's sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the water that Elijah had requested to be poured in a trench surrounding the altar. I want to finish this episode by mentioning that there are 2 altars in the Old Testament that stand in contrast to the earthen altars or the ones made of uncut stones. They were the altars that the Lord God himself designed for the tabernacle and later for the temple. The altar of burnt offerings was made of wood and bronze, and the altar of incense was made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. Even though they were different from the earthen or stone altars, they too were made out of materials that the Lord God had made at creation. You know, the plain natural altars that we explore today symbolize the humility and purity required for the worship of the Lord God. They were to remind people that their focus should always be on God's glory and His holiness, not on human creativity or achievement. And that's something for us to keep in mind as we worship our God. Rock on. Natural altars. If you have any comments or questions regarding this episode or series, I'd love to hear from you. Just email me at bruce@timeofgrace.org. In our next episode, we'll be exploring the references to stones and rocks in the book of Psalms, the songbook of God's Old Testament people. Thanks for listening, and God bless.